Silence. Not the peaceful quiet of dawn, but the ringing, hollow silence after the storm of gunfire. It pressed in on Abigail, thick and suffocating, tasting of burnt powder and something else, something metallic and final. She stood framed in the shattered doorway of the church, her wedding dress, once pristine white, now a canvas of impossible crimson stains. Sunlight streamed through new, ragged holes in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing above the sprawled forms of friends, neighbors, her intended husband. This wasn't grief yet. It was shock, cold and absolute, leaving her adrift in the wreckage of the life she'd reached for only moments before. Then, through the haze of smoke and disbelief, she saw him, standing apart from the stunned townsfolk, silent as a canyon shadow. Koda, a Comanche warrior, his eyes missing nothing, fixed first on the carnage, then on her. Why was he here? And in the sudden, brutal emptiness of her world, why did his forbidding presence feel like the only solid thing left? Her dream of peace had just been slaughtered now. Survival depended on understanding the warrior watching her, and the terrible truth buried beneath the blood-soaked floorboards of the church. Months earlier, the journey to Redemption Creek had felt like the final leg of a long escape. Abigail carried the weight of past sorrows, seeking not fortune, but a quiet corner to simply be. Redemption Creek offered the illusion of sanctuary, nestled against sun-drenched hills, its single dusty street lined with the familiar facades of a frontier town, mercantile, saloon, livery stable, and the rhythmic heartbeat of the blacksmith's forge. That forge belonged to Thomas Albright. Thomas. He was the anchor she thought she needed. Strong, capable hands accustomed to shaping metal, a smile that seemed to promise steadiness, a gentle courtship that spoke of shared futures, quiet evenings, the simple respectability she craved. He painted a picture of a life sheltered from the harsh winds that had buffeted her past. Abigail, hungry for stability, had allowed herself to believe. She saw his apparent solidity, his easy way with the townsfolk, the plans he had for expanding his business, and mistook ambition for simple industry. She'd agreed to marry him, her hope a fragile desert flower pushing through cracked earth. Working part-time for Mrs. Gable at the mercantile, arranging tins and weighing sugar, she felt herself slowly becoming part of the town's fabric, though her natural reserve kept her interactions quiet, observant rather than effusive. But Redemption Creek, like most frontier towns, wore a peaceful mask over simmering tensions. Water was life, and rights to the creek were a constant source of low-level friction. Unmarked boundaries blurred between settlement land and territories the Comanche, Apache, and others still considered ancestral hunting grounds, leading to wary glances and muttered suspicions whenever lone riders were spotted on the ridges. Even Thomas, the picture of forthrightness, occasionally betrayed a tension that Abigail, in her hopeful state, tried to ignore. A tightening around his eyes when talk turned to overdue freight shipments, a habit of glancing over his shoulder when leaving the smithy late at night, a certain restless energy beneath the calm exterior. She'd attributed it to the pressures of building a life, the natural anxieties of the frontier. She focused on the plans for their small cabin, the wedding dress she stitched with careful, hopeful fingers, deliberately smoothing over the faint, unsettling ripples in the placid surface of her intended future. She couldn't see the dangerous currents running deep beneath. The first overt sign of trouble arrived with the dust and the heat of a late afternoon. Cain Barlow and his riders didn't gallop into town. They ambled a slow, deliberate menace that drew eyes and silenced conversations. They were hard men, clad in trail-worn leather and dust, faces baked by sun and wind into masks of indifference or outright cruelty. Barlow led them, sitting his horse with arrogant stillness. His eyes, the pale, flat blue of ice, scanned the street with a predator's casual assessment. A long, white scar pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent, chilling semblance of a smile. Twin Colts rested easy on his hips, worn smooth from use. His presence alone felt like a physical weight pressing down on the town. His men dispersed slightly, their postures radiating a coiled readiness that belied their casual movements. They weren't here for supplies or whiskey. They were here with purpose. Barlow dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the thick dust before the blacksmith shop. Thomas emerged, wiping sweat and soot from his brow with a rag. His welcoming blacksmith smile seemed forced, strained at the edges. From the mercantile window, Abigail felt a prickle of unease. The distance was too great to hear words, but the body language spoke volumes. Barlow stood close, invading Thomas's space. His gestures were sharp, demanding. Thomas seemed to be explaining, placating, shaking his head slightly, his shoulders hunched defensively. Barlow leaned in, his scarred face inches from Thomas's, his voice apparently dropping lower, more intense. Thomas actually took a half step back, a flicker of fear crossing his features before being quickly masked. Then, abruptly, Barlow stepped back, let out a short, harsh laugh that held no warmth, and clapped Thomas on the shoulder with enough force to make him rock back on his heels. It was a gesture of dominance, not camaraderie. As Barlow turned back towards his horse, his icy gaze swept across the street and snagged on Abigail watching from the window. Time seemed to slow. He looked her up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and terribly exposed. A knowing, unpleasant smirk touched his lips. He gave a slight, almost mocking inclination of his head before swinging back into the saddle. Without a backward glance, he and his men rode out, leaving a palpable tension hanging in the dusty air, thicker than before they arrived. That evening, Abigail voiced her concern. Who were those men? Thomas was quick to reassure her. Maybe too quick. Just drifters, looking for work, he'd said. Nothing to fret about, Abby. He'd busied himself at the forge, avoiding her gaze. His hands, usually so steady, had fumbled slightly with his hammer. She tried to accept his explanation, wanting desperately for it to be true. The wedding was so close. But Barlow's evaluating stare, the chilling lack of warmth in his eyes, stayed with her, a discordant note beneath the hopeful melody she was trying to compose for her future. A seed of doubt had been planted, watered by Thomas's evasiveness. The final weeks dissolved into a flurry of wedding preparations, a forced gaiety overlaying the town's low hum of anxiety. Abigail focused on the tangible, the crisp white cotton of her dress, the wildflowers Thomas gathered for her from the hillsides, small gestures meant to reassure, to solidify the image of their peaceful future. Mrs. Gable pressed a small, smooth worry stone into her hand. For luck, dearie, she'd murmured, though her eyes held the pragmatic weariness of someone who knew luck was a fickle commodity on the frontier. Beneath the surface preparations, whispers continued. Hemlock's missing blasting powder remained a mystery. Cooper insisted he hadn't imagined those horses by the creek, shod with unfamiliar brands. A lone prospector riding in for supplies spoke of finding his camp ransacked, nothing valuable taken, just disruption malice. Isolated incidents, perhaps, easily dismissed as the usual frontier uncertainties. But taken together, they felt like tightening threads of unseen tension. And the silent watcher remained. Koda, the Comanche warrior, was sighted more frequently now on the mesas overlooking the valley. A solitary figure, still as the ancient rock formations, his gaze steady, patient. Townsfolk speculated nervously. Was he a scout? A harbinger of trouble? But he never approached, never threatened. He just watched. Often, his attention seemed fixed not on the town, but on the eastern trails, the direction Barlow had ridden. Abigail saw him one evening, silhouetted against a blood-orange sunset, a powerful, unsettling presence. He felt less like a person, more like an omen, a physical manifestation of the wilderness's indifference to settler dreams. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter, trying to shake off the feeling that unseen eyes were measuring the town, measuring her future, finding it wanting. The wedding morning arrived bathed in the deceptive brilliance of a clear, southwestern sky. Abigail stood before the small mirror in her room above the mercantile, smoothing the folds of her simple dress. The woman looking back seemed unreal, pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and a deep, unshakable apprehension she couldn't name. Thomas arrived, looking scrubbed and earnest in a dark suit coat that strained slightly across his broad shoulders. His smile was wide, perhaps a touch too bright. "Ready to become Mrs. Albright?" he asked, his voice attempting a lightness that didn't quite ring true. She nodded, her own smile feeling thin and fragile on her lips. The church bell tolled, a gentle summons across the dusty square. Inside, the familiar faces of Redemption Creek looked back at her from the pews, their expressions reflecting hope, curiosity, the shared desire for a happy occasion. Candles flickered, casting a warm, deceptive glow. Reverend Miller waited at the altar, his kind face beaming. Thomas took her arm, his grip perhaps a little too tight. She focused on the altar, on the solemn words promising union and sanctuary, consciously pushing aside the nagging unease, the memory of cold eyes and silent watchers on the hills. This was her haven. This was her new beginning. They stood before the preacher. The air grew still. Reverend Miller began, his voice calm and resonant in the small space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The words flowed, familiar, comforting. Abigail risked a glance at Thomas. He met her gaze, his eyes seeming to hold genuine affection. Relief washed through her, potent and cleansing. Maybe the shadows were just shadows. "Do you, Thomas Albright, take this woman?" The question hung suspended in the warm, still air. Then the world exploded. The church doors didn't just open. They imploded inwards, ripped from their hinges by sheer force, with splintering like matchsticks. Cain Barlow stood silhouetted against the blinding outdoor light, a figure of pure menace. His Colt was already spitting fire, the roar deafening within the confined space. Plaster rained down where the first bullet struck the ceiling high above the altar. Time fractured. Screams tore through the sacred silence. Barlow's men surged in behind him, a wave of brutal efficiency, guns blazing without discrimination. Pews overturned as people scrambled for impossible cover. The air turned thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the sharp crackle of shots, the whine of ricocheting lead, and the wet, final sounds of impact. Reverend Miller crumpled, his Bible skittering across the floorboards. Abigail saw Mrs. Gable clutch her chest, a look of utter disbelief on her face before she fell. Thomas reacted with a speed that surprised her. He shoved her violently backwards, sending her stumbling behind the heavy, carved oak altar. "Get down, Abby," he choked out, his voice strained with sudden terror. As she fell, she saw him draw a weapon, not blacksmith tongs, but a small, gleaming derringer she'd never known he possessed. He fired once, a panicked, ineffective shot towards the doorway. Barlow's harsh laugh cut through the din. He raised his own pistol with chilling deliberation, aimed not at the ceiling, but directly at Thomas. The shot echoed, flat and final. Thomas jerked as if struck by an invisible fist. A dark, rapidly spreading stain appeared on the front of his borrowed coat. He staggered, his eyes wide with shocked pain, and something else Abigail couldn't decipher in that fleeting, terrible second. Confusion? Betrayal? He collapsed onto the floor near where she huddled, his eyes finding hers for one brief, vacant moment before glazing over with the stillness of death. Abigail pressed herself against the floor behind the altar, hands clamped over her mouth to stifle the scream tearing at her throat. The oak offered pathetic shelter. Bullets thudded into the wood, sending splinters flying. She could hear the attackers' rough shouts, the terrified moans of the wounded turning into death rattles, the relentless punctuation of gunfire. It was a maelstrom of violence, executed with horrifying speed and precision. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying incoherently, expecting the burn of lead at any second. Then, as suddenly as it erupted, the main volley of shots ceased. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden floor. Grunts, curses, the clink of metal. They were moving through the aftermath, kicking bodies, searching pockets. Abigail held her breath, each footfall outside her flimsy shield, sending waves of terror through her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough, she feared, to betray her hiding place. She heard Barlow's voice, sharp and devoid of emotion. "Check him. Make sure it's done right." Boots stopped near Thomas's body. A pause, then a rough voice confirmed. "Yeah, boss. He's gone colder in yesterday's coffee." "Got the pouch." Barlow again, satisfied. "Got it. What now? Burn it? Leave a message?" A moment of chilling consideration. "Nah. Leave him. Let the buzzards and the preacher's God sort 'em out. A warning to anyone else thinks they can cross me. Move out." The heavy footsteps retreated towards the shattered doorway. Horses whinnied outside. Then the thunder of hooves faded rapidly into the distance, leaving behind a silence more profound and terrifying than the preceding violence. How long Abigail lay there, paralyzed behind the altar, she couldn't say. Time lost meaning. The only sounds were the soft, ragged gasps of the few still clinging to life, the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the floorboards, and the distant, horrified shouts beginning to rise from the town square as people emerged from hiding. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the sharp stink of spent gunpowder. Slowly, trembling violently, she forced herself to peek over the edge of the altar. The scene was an abomination. Bodies lay tangled amidst the wreckage of the pews, bathed in the strangely beautiful shafts of sunlight piercing the bullet-riddled walls. Her wedding day, her sanctuary, defiled beyond recognition. Thomas lay mere feet away, eyes open, staring sightlessly towards the violated ceiling. The image of his last expression, that flicker of something unreadable, returned to her. The man she was to marry murdered, the dream of safety annihilated. A cold wave washed through her, extinguishing grief before it could fully ignite, leaving only a vast, echoing emptiness. She pushed herself up on unsteady legs, her stained dress clinging to her, a grotesque mockery. She had to get out. She stumbled towards the light, stepping carefully over fallen neighbors, her mind refusing to process the individual faces, the sheer scale of the horror. She emerged into the harsh sunlight, blinking, swaying. The town square was filling with stunned survivors, faces ashen, eyes wide with disbelief. A collective moan of anguish began to build. Abigail stood alone in the center of it, a specter in white and red, the focal point of a tragedy she couldn't comprehend. Help felt impossibly far away. The law was just one overwhelmed marshal, likely hiding or already dead. There was only the carnage behind her and the dazed community before her. Then, materializing from the edge of the chaos, as if summoned by the silence, Koda appeared. His pony stood nearby, untroubled. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone utterly at home in moments of upheaval. His dark, piercing eyes swept the scene, the terrified settlers, the smoking ruin of the church, the tracks leading away. He ignored the fearful stares directed his way. His attention seemed purely analytical. He walked directly towards the church, his expression unreadable, passing Abigail as if she were merely part of the devastated landscape. A strange compulsion, perhaps the need for any action, any focus other than the abyss opening within her, drew Abigail back to the threshold of the church. She watched Koda step inside, moving with quiet purpose through the gruesome scene. He wasn't looking for survivors. He was reading the story written in blood and violence. He stopped beside Thomas's body, kneeling not in reverence, but in examination. His sharp gaze scanned the floorboards around the fallen blacksmith. He noticed something Abigail hadn't, half hidden beneath Thomas's outstretched hand, partially obscured by the spreading bloodstain. He reached down carefully and retrieved it. It was the tooled leather pouch, intricate and unique, clearly not standard frontier gear. But beside it, clutched loosely in Thomas's dead fingers, was something else Koda now gently pried loose, a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. Koda unfolded it carefully. It contained not gold, but what looked like a crudely drawn map, marking routes through specific canyons known for smuggling, and a single, distinctive brass token bearing Barlow's crude cattle brand, a coiled rattlesnake. Evidence. undeniable proof of deep involvement. Koda stood, holding the pouch and the damning map packet. He turned and looked directly at Abigail, still hovering in the doorway, her mind reeling. He walked towards her, his stride measured, his face grim. He held out the pouch and the map. His English was sparse, accented, but the meaning was brutally clear. Barlow not come for wedding. He pointed at the evidence, then emphatically at Thomas's body. He come for thief. Abigail stared, the blood draining from her face. Thief? Thomas. Involved with Barlow? The map, the token, the secret derringer. Thomas's evasiveness. Barlow's chilling confidence. It all crashed together in her mind, a sickening tidal wave of realization. This horror wasn't random. It was calculated retribution. Thomas hadn't just been a blacksmith seeking a peaceful life. He'd been playing a dangerous game with a ruthless killer, had likely double-crossed him over smuggling routes or stolen goods, and had tried to hide behind the facade of marriage and respectability. Her grief twisted into something sharp and agonizingly bitter betrayal. The foundation of her hoped-for life wasn't just cracked. It was built on lies, and the collapse had claimed everyone around her. Koda watched the understanding dawn in her eyes, saw the flicker of raw fury beginning to burn through the shock. He tucked the pouch and map securely into his own waistband. His gaze shifted towards the eastern plains, where Barlow's dust had settled. Then it returned to Abigail, standing lost in her blood-splattered gown. He offered no pity, only the harsh reality of the frontier. He gestured down the trail Barlow had taken. Then he gestured back towards the weeping town, towards the task of burying the dead. His stare was unwavering, a choice presented without words, pursuit or despair. He had his own reasons for hunting Barlow. Abigail could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes tracked the fleeing riders. Perhaps Barlow's coiled snake brand was known to Koda's people, associated with stolen horses, raided camps, lost kin. Their separate quests for justice had intersected in this place of slaughter. Abigail looked down at the crimson staining her dress, then at the still form of the man whose lies had cost so much. She looked back into the church, at the faces she would never see smile again. The shy, hopeful woman was gone, consumed in the fire. Something else rose from the ashes, colder, harder, fueled by a righteous fury that eclipsed fear. Tears threatened, hot and fierce, but she blinked them back, refusing to shed them here and now. She met Koda's intense gaze. The understanding passed between them, silent and absolute. She lifted her chin, her jaw hardening into a line Thomas never would have recognized. She nodded once, sharply, towards the trail, towards Barlow, towards the reckoning. The hunt began without ceremony. Koda procured a sturdy horse from the livery stable, its owner too stunned to object. He handed Abigail a canteen and a leather satchel containing jerky and hardtack. Then he swung onto his pony and set off east, not looking back, simply expecting her to follow. Abigail ripped away the bottom section of her ruined dress, the heavy, blood-soaked fabric impeding movement. Leaving the tattered remnants behind, she mounted the horse, the leather of the saddle unfamiliar beneath her. She did not glance back at Redemption Creek. The town, the church, the dead, they belonged to a life that had ceased to exist. Her focus narrowed to the warrior riding ahead, and the vast, indifferent horizon that concealed Cain Barlow. The land stretched before them, brutal and beautiful. Sun-baked earth cracked under hoof. Sparse vegetation offered little shade, and the wind whispered relentlessly across empty plains and through jagged canyons. Koda moved through this world as if born of it, his knowledge innate, profound. He didn't lecture Abigail. He taught through action, through correction harsh and immediate. A sharp gesture indicated a patch of disturbed earth Barlow's horses had passed hours before. A low grunt warned her away from seemingly harmless berries. He showed her how to find precious water seeping from rock faces, how to make a smokeless fire, how to listen to the language of the birds and the insects for signs of danger or passage. He drilled her relentlessly with the rifle he'd acquired, a heavy Winchester, forcing her to load, aim, fire, and reload until her shoulder ached and her hands, raw and blistered, began to obey instinctively. The softness left her. Her skin darkened and toughened under the sun. Her muscles learned the aches of long riding and hard walking. The hesitant bride vanished, replaced by a woman whose eyes constantly scanned the terrain, whose ears strained for unnatural sounds, whose mind, once filled with hopes for a quiet future, now held only the grim calculus of survival and the burning image of Cain Barlow's face. Grief remained, a cold not deep inside, but it was now entwined with the sharp, unforgiving edge of Thomas's betrayal and the searing anger towards the man who had orchestrated the slaughter. She learned silence, not as passivity, but as watchful readiness. Their communication remained sparse, often just a shared glance across a campfire, a nod of understanding when Koda pointed out a track, a quiet correction when Abigail made a mistake gathering firewood. Yet, a grudging respect grew between them. Koda saw her endure without complaint, saw the fear in her eyes slowly being replaced by determination. He began to trust her watchfulness, her improving aim. Abigail, in turn, learned to read his subtle cues, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders that meant trouble nearby, the slight shift in his horse's gait that indicated a change in terrain ahead. He was no longer just a mysterious warrior. He was her teacher, her protector, her unlikely partner in this grim pursuit. They pushed hard, leveraging Koda's knowledge of shortcuts and hidden water sources against the gang's likely assumption of safety. Days blurred into a rhythm of tracking, riding, sparse meals, and watchful nights. They found hastily abandoned campsites, evidence of Barlow's passage growing fresher. Koda discovered droppings indicating one of their horses was going lame, a small sign, but potentially crucial. He also found a discarded kerchief near one cold fire pit, bearing the same coiled snake motif as the token found on Thomas. Barlow was getting careless, or confident. Koda chose their battleground carefully, a twisting box canyon, known to him from hunts in seasons past. High walls offered vantage points and denied easy escape. Narrow passages created natural choke points. He outlined the plan with gestures in the dust and a few terse words. Ambush, division, no frontal assault. He would take the high rim. She would cover the narrowest point near the canyon's entrance, forcing them deeper into the trap. Waiting was the hardest part. Crouched behind a tumble of weathered sandstone, rifle resting on a rock, Abigail listened to the wind's lonely song, her heart pounding a heavy, steady rhythm against her ribs. The ghosts of the church flickered at the edge of her vision. She pushed them back, focusing on the cold weight of the rifle, the feel of the trigger beneath her finger. Then noise. The careless clatter of shod hooves on rock, fragments of rough laughter, the jingle of gear. Barlow's gang rode into the canyon's mouth, relaxed, unsuspecting. Koda's signal was silence itself. An arrow hissed from the rimrock above, striking the last rider in the column. The man gave a choked cry and pitched sideways from his horse. Before the others could fully react, a second arrow flew, felling another. Confusion erupted into panic. Men yelled, drawing weapons, firing wildly towards the cliffs where they glimpsed movement. Two riders spurred their horses, trying to bolt back out of the canyon entrance, directly towards Abigail's position. This was her moment. The tremor in her hands was still there, but overlaid now with icy control. She lined up the sights on the lead rider, remembering Koda's instruction: breathe out, squeeze, don't jerk. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder. The man flew backwards off his horse. The second rider swerved, diving behind a sparse cluster of rocks, firing blindly in her direction. Bullets smacked into the sandstone around her. The canyon became a deadly echo chamber. Gunfire reverberated off the rock walls. Koda, moving with impossible speed and silence along the rim, picked off targets of opportunity, his arrows unerring, sowing chaos, forcing the remaining outlaws further into the canyon's embrace. Abigail reloaded, the metallic click loud in a momentary lull. Her movements were surer now, less hesitant. She spotted the man pinned down near her, peering out. She fired again. He slumped forward, still. The cold efficiency scared her, yet satisfied a deep, burning need for retribution. Soon, only 3 figures remained alive on the canyon floor, taking cover behind a cluster of large boulders near the center. Cain Barlow, flanked by 2 of his most hardened men. Koda descended from the rimrock like a striking hawk, knife flashing in the sunlight. He engaged the 2 henchmen, a whirlwind of lethal motion, too fast for them to react effectively. The sounds were brief, brutal, final. Leaving Cain Barlow alone, he rose from cover, pistol in hand, searching for the source of the arrows. Then he saw Abigail stepping out from behind her rocks, the Winchester leveled, her face grim, her eyes locked onto his. Recognition dawned, followed by disbelief, then pure, unadulterated rage. "You!" he snarled, his scarred lip curling. His voice was incredulous. "Should have made sure you burned with the rest." He raised his pistol and fired. The shot went wide as Abigail instinctively flinched, but she didn't retreat. "Why, Barlow?" she yelled, her voice hoarse, carrying over the sudden silence. "Why kill them all?" "For Thomas?" Barlow laughed, that chilling, humorless sound echoing in the canyon. "Your precious blacksmith? He got ambitious. Thought he could use my routes, take my cut, then hide behind a skirt and a prayer book." He spat contemptuously onto the dusty ground. Nobody steals from Cain Barlow and lives to tell it. He learned his lesson. They all did. A warning. His utter lack of remorse, his casual dismissal of the lives destroyed, solidified the purpose that had driven her across miles of wilderness. She raised the rifle again, centering the sight on his chest. He fired again, almost simultaneously. White-hot pain exploded in her left arm, spinning her halfway around, but muscle memory took over. Her finger tightened on the trigger even as she stumbled. Her shot struck Barlow squarely in the shoulder. He cried out, a strangled sound of pain and surprise, dropping his Colt as his arm went limp. He staggered back, fetching up hard against the sheer canyon wall, eyes wide with the sudden, stark realization of his own mortality. Abigail straightened, ignoring the throbbing fire in her arm. The rifle still held ready, though lowered slightly. She walked towards him, stopping several paces away. She looked into the pale eyes that had haunted her waking and sleeping moments. The fear was gone, replaced by a vast, weary emptiness and the grim weight of consequence. Koda appeared beside her, silent, his knife clean, his expression unreadable but for a flicker of grim finality. Barlow stared from Abigail's cold face to Koda's implacable one. Defeated, broken, he slid slowly down the rock face, leaving a crimson smear, coming to rest in a sitting position in the dust. Abigail didn't waste words. There was nothing left that needed saying between them. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the rifle completely. The debt was paid. The cycle of violence, for this moment, had ended. The aftermath was quiet, save for the buzzing flies and the mournful cry of a distant hawk. Koda moved with grim efficiency, collecting weapons, ammunition, and the pouch and map packet from Barlow's body, adding them to the loot stripped from the other outlaws, coins, jewelry, items stolen from the churchgoers. He piled it all near Abigail. She gazed at the tragic hoard, the tangible price of Thomas's deceit and Barlow's brutality, and felt a profound revulsion. Koda gestured towards a pile, then back towards the direction of Redemption Creek. A silent question. Would she take it back? Restore what could be restored? Abigail shook her head. That life, that town, felt impossibly distant now, belonging to someone else. Let the desert keep its secrets and its spoils. She looked down at her bleeding arm. Koda stepped forward, tearing strips from Barlow's own shirt. His touch was unexpectedly careful as he cleaned and bound the wound tightly. Then his gaze fell upon the tattered, stained remnants of her wedding dress. Abigail understood. She met his eyes. Then deliberately, almost ritually, she unfastened the remaining buttons and shrugged out of the ruined garment. It fell in a heap at her feet, a symbol of a life violently erased, a self shed like snakeskin. Beneath it, she wore the practical shirt and trousers acquired during their journey. Koda observed the act, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't approval or disapproval. It was acknowledgement, recognition of the crucible she had passed through, the transformation she had undergone. He gathered the usable supplies, leaving the bodies to the elements. He mounted his pony. Abigail swung onto her horse, her movements stiff but steady. They rode out of the canyon side by side, leaving the dead and the ghosts behind. They didn't turn back towards Redemption Creek. Their paths diverged from the main trail soon after, Koda heading towards the Northern Territories, towards his own people, his own life. Abigail paused, watching him go, a lone figure merging with the vast landscape. He didn't look back. Their alliance, forged in blood and necessity, was complete. She turned her horse south, towards an unknown horizon. No longer Abigail Albright, the hopeful bride. No longer just a victim. She was something new, forged in the unforgiving fire of the West. Where she was going, she didn't know. What she would become remained unwritten. But as she rode alone into the immense, indifferent silence, she carried not the hope for peace, but the hard-won strength of survival. And on the frontier, that might be the only true currency.